Words are powerful things, aren't they? They're things that we measure out our lives with. They're things that give us a sense of detail, of the fabric of our interactions with each other. And words carry with them a whole set of values. When you use a word and it comes chugging along, it pulls behind it a whole freight train of associations and of values, of storylines. We tell the story of our life using words. For sociolinguistic theorists, they will also talk about words as being frames. They set up these little frames through which we view the world. We decide what relates to us, what's important to us, what we can disregard, how to interpret this vast barrage of information we receive all the time. So this week we're hearing lots of powerful and resonant words in the course of the week. It's Bristol Big Week after all, and people are talking about all of these kinds of things. These words which I'm keeping under cover at the moment for fear that as soon as they come bouncing out, they'll explode with all of the meanings that you choose to stick onto them. And we've got a very powerful word tonight, which is at the center of what we're talking about, which is growth. Growth, growing. Let's not talk about growth in the context that we might be applying it. Let's think about the word in terms of how we're associated. Growing things, the vibrancy of life, ontogeny, the growth in the womb, the fetus, the baby, the children, maturation, personal growth, new ideas, new inspirations, societal growth, civilization, moving forward, progress. See, growth is a very, very tricky word, isn't it? Because this growth, if we just look at it in isolation, is bringing behind it such a range of positive, vibrant associations that when we couple it with economic growth, that economic side really benefits from this whole set of associated values. It's actually quite interesting, this thing of economic growth, because I don't know if you know, on Google you can go and have a look and see the use of words in books over the last 200 years, because they've scanned all of these books in. And if you do that, you actually realize that the phrase economic growth scarcely appeared before the 1950s. In fact, economic growth as a phrase has been growing exponentially. There's a growth in growth. It's increased 60-fold the usage of economic growth in books and publications. So it's not an accident that these two words have come and rammed into each other. Clearly, when people were looking around for the language to use, which used to be material progress, that's what Adam Smith called it, and they caught on this phrase economic growth, it had this resonance which really pleased them and worked well for them. It also means, of course, that if we go out there and we say that we're anti-growth, we are going head-to-head with a set of very positive, life-affirming values. So, for example, Richard Heinberg has a book out called An End to Growth. There's actually a big movement in France called the décroissance, which is, before you get too excited about a movement based around those little flaky, buttery pastries, is French for degrowth. Of course, limits of growth, the famous Club of Rome report. And when you go out there and you say, I'm anti-growth, I'm opposed to growth, of course, in a way it's almost like going out there and saying, I'm anti-babies, I'm anti-lambs, I'm anti all of those positive growing associations. Because the opposite of growth is decline, restriction, contraction, and ultimately, of course, although we keep it at the side of our psyche, we always know that there's death lurking there as well. This is a powerful word to mess around with. You know, campaigners rarely appreciate or understand the importance or power of the words they work with. Our enemies, the people who might seek to oppose action on the environment, understand these things much, much better. Some years ago, the Competitive Enterprise Institute in the US ran a series of adverts across the US called Carbon Dioxide. We call it life. So they were going for this life power. And the metaphor that they shared with people there was they were saying, some people want to have carbon dioxide defined as a poison. Think what that would mean for our life. And they showed on the screen at that point lights going out all over the place. Lights of Times Square blinking out. Think, okay, they understand the language and the resonance of, as it were, these metaphors when they talk about them. A year or two later, a very large environmental organization who I've worked for and I'd like to work for again, so I won't necessarily name them, or their big, furry, cuddly, bamboo-eating mascot, had started a thing called Earth Hour, in which people were actively encouraged, and the whole point was to go out and turn your lights off. And on the website and all of the promotions, they have all of these pictures of things like Times Square or Piccadilly Circus with the lights blinking out, bringing with it this whole association. In what cultural context are lights being turned out something associated with positive aspiration? Because let's face it, all of the deep resonances are with decline, morbidity, death. Right? So that's what I'm saying is the battlefield we're working with growth. This is what we're kind of struggling with when we try and find the right sort of language. So it raises an interesting challenge for us. How do we deal with it? What are we going to do with this growth thing? I'd say, well, maybe there's like 3 things we could do. We could reframe it. Yeah? Or we could reinvent it. Or we could rename it. So one thing that we could do is that we can, oh, sorry, I forgot there's another one. Reclaim it. I knew that they were clever, but they rhymed. We could reclaim it, we could reframe it, or we could reinvent it, which I know doesn't rhyme. We can reclaim it. We can say, let's take growth, and we are not talking about your growth, we're talking about our growth. Yeah? We're not talking about your nasty, destructive growth. We're talking about green growth. We're talking about sustainable growth. Yeah? I think this is a tricky strategy because, of course, not only is growth as a concept and as a word now so solidly owned and associated with economic growth, but of course, every time we say it, it triggers that set of associations. It's actually very hard to reclaim a word which has been so, it's a bit like trying to crack open a molecule where the parts have just become so tightly fixed together. Every time that you're doing it, you're conjuring up all of the frames associated with the thing that you're trying to criticize. So maybe one of the things that we can do with it is that we can reframe it. We could talk about growth as being, well, let's look at growth from a different angle. We could say, maybe from the positive point of view, we can say, no, we are talking about growth, but we're talking about the kind of growth that's personal growth. In other words, not expanding madly all over the place, but is actually focused on working and building and making things better within as it were, the constraints or the limits. We could try from a negative point of view to reframe growth as saying, okay, this is the kind of growth like cancer is a growth. That's another sense of growth. But, you know, I think we have the same problems with this, but that growth becomes something we're fighting with existing values and existing meaning, which is a tricky thing to do, especially when you're only one voice amongst many, which, let's face it, are more powerful and louder often. So I'm really interested in this idea of how we can reinvent the language around criticizing economic growth. I think I've just been doing the last 6 months focus groups right across Wales to help the Welsh Government to reinvent the language that they use for sustainable development in Wales. What's interesting is that growth isn't really something which resonates very strongly with people at all. Nor indeed, not surprisingly, are phrases like sustainable development. People's concerns are very much actually with community, family, and right now very much with protecting, securing, stability, keeping a balance in their own lives between work and family, and also a balance in the relationship between things. So I think that this is the rich area in which we should be looking for an alternative language, not saying we are anti-growth, but saying, no, we are for this. It's interesting, you know, Herman Daly's work, of course, talking about a steady state economy, talking about steadiness, balance, are, I think, the places to look for new language. And I just have a final thought to share with you. You remember I said that actually for many years the language that was talked about was material progress. I'd like to suggest that the word progress could actually do with reinvigoration. Because even though progress is a fought over term, progress is something that people that is not, it's a battlefield term that hasn't been exclusively owned by one side or the other. It has a resonance where you can still debate, no, not what you mean by progress, what I mean by progress is an aspiration we could run for. So give a plug for this as the word. But the final point to make is we have to be careful about what we say. We have to be careful not to trigger the sort of like negative, dangerous kinds of values that can undermine what we're saying. And I put out a plea, which maybe we could discuss later, for finding an alternative language for the thing that we're standing for. Thank you.